In spite of the wickedness that Israel finds themselves in, when they decide to come back to God, He is more than adequate and more than merciful and more than willing to change our name and to reclaim us and begin showing us compassion and grace once again. You cannot venture far enough into sin so that God becomes a permanent rejecter of your life. And herein is grace. That which was not my people becomes my people. That which is experiencing no more compassion will now experience the reception of my love once again. And the grace is this, that even when our name, all right, here comes a name tag, even when our name is sinner, and even when our name is one who rejects God, we can still find grace in His eyes. Why is it that we give? If we were to be extremely transparent this morning, and you think about dropping a check in an offering plate, or you talk about giving of your tithes and offerings, every one of us at one stage in life or another have probably placed money in a plate or given to the church and thought, I really could use that somewhere else. Okay, let's rewind. I've thought that way before. Is that too transparent? Maybe that's too honest to say on a Sunday morning. Every one of us have thought we've got bills, we have burdens, we have issues. Maybe we've been laid off and income is not where it would be desirable to be. And yet we think there's so much more I could have done with that money. And so then it comes back to the question, well, then why did you do it? Why stay faithful when the bank account seems to be dwindling? Why give out of a cheerful heart when it seems like there are so many other ways I could have used that money? And I'm semi okay with the fact that got really quiet when I made that statement, because I think that says a lot. And there's nothing wrong with being transparent and honest. We're all family here. We've all thought that way, probably to some degree. I want to give you a twofold statement. And I want you to hang on to this statement. I'll bring it up at the end of our message this morning. We'll build on it for next Sunday. But let's do our best to try to understand why it is that we should feel zero arm twisting when it comes to financially giving. And here is the statement. Eternal redemption changes temporal routines. Okay? Would you jot that down or take a mental screenshot of that statement? Because this is the foundation for the next 2 weeks, this morning and next week. Eternal redemption changes temporal routines. This morning I want to focus on the beginning of that statement. Eternal redemption. What in the world does that mean? And I understand that if you're in Sunday school this morning, you perhaps discussed that word, that holy vocabulary of redemption. And Hosea is a beautiful story that helps us understand exactly what redemption is. So let's think about this. Now, as well as you hopefully have found Hosea chapter 1 by this point, did you get a hello, my name is tag? I see some people already wearing them. Good for you, showing initiative, writing your name down. If you didn't, grab that, and as we begin our study, jot your name down on that. You don't have to slap it on your shirt if you don't want to. You know, it's going to serve to prove a point in just a minute. But I want you to write your name down on that as we go through this. Hosea is the first book of what the Hebrews call the 12. It's what we call the minor prophets. Hosea's name means salvation. And outside of this prophetic book, we don't know very much about him. Hosea lived during a time where Israel was divided into a northern and southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was called Israel, the southern kingdom being called Judah. And what we're about to study this morning is a dual factual study. There are multiple things that are true at the same time. And I have to lay this foundation before we go any farther. You got to understand this. As you look through Hosea, really the entire book, but specifically the first 3 chapters, we understand that this is a illustrative details concerning Israel. What Hosea is prophesying was directed specifically at the condition of Israel and what God was predicting is going to take place in the future. However, two things are true at once. While this was directly related to Israel and the coming days of their nation, we have to also understand this as factual events that happened in a real guy's life by the name of Hosea. And Hosea now has the opportunity for his life to develop an illustration to Israel of what is coming. And as we study this, Israel has found themselves experiencing great prosperity under their leader by the name of King Jeroboam II. But as it goes, and we know this to be very true, that earthly prosperity can lead to spiritual bankruptcy. And that's where Israel was. They were high on life and low on God. And so they had become a kingdom that was obsessed with greed, obsessed with covetousness. And yet the story of Hosea serves as an illustration specifically to Israel, and the application applies to you and I pray, at the end of this. So as you go through the narrative, you can discover really three main characteristics of God as you look at three different characters of the study. That's what I'd like to show you this morning. Three main characteristics of God, looking at some of the people that are shown in this narrative. So you look at Hosea chapter 1, and would you start with me in the first two verses? The word of the Lord that came unto Hosea, the son of Beeri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. The beginning of the word of the Lord by Hosea. And the Lord said to Hosea, Go take unto thee a wife of whoredoms and children of whoredoms, for the land hath committed great whoredom, departing from the Lord. Now, we see mentioned in verse number 2 a very targeted and a very specific problem and sin that is mentioned. And so what we find here is, and to give you one of the three characteristics of God that we're going to study, the first one is this: God is gracious. Okay? I want you to think, remember the beginning statement was this: eternal redemption. That's what we're focusing on. And the first thing that we learned this morning is the fact that God is a gracious Redeemer. In verse number 2, you have a command that's given to Hosea. The prophet receives a simple instruction. You need to go marry a woman of very extremely low moral standards, a prostitute. We must remember that Hosea's marriage is being used as an illustration for Israel, and you must draw a parallel in the fact that as is phrased in verse number 2, that prostitution or immorality was a reference to Israel's relationship to false gods. Now remember with me that Israel has found themselves walking away from the one true God to serve false gods, a lot of due to the fact that they were experiencing such stability. Things were going well for them. And here's Hosea being called of God to give to Israel an illustration of the sinful condition of Israel. And God says, I want you to go find a wife that will illustrate Israel's sinful condition. I want you to go and find a wife that's a prostitute. Could you imagine, for a man, a prophet like Hosea, what that must have been like to hear those words out of the mouth of God? Do you think that maybe for a second Hosea questioned what he just heard? Do you think from just a second maybe Hosea heard those words and thought, is that really God saying that? Doesn't make a lot of sense. You want me to do what? You want me to marry who? Well, what happened to, and of course it wasn't penned by them, but you and I might think biblically into 1 Corinthians, what happened to being unequally yoked and all of that stuff? Where did that go? And yet the truth is, Hosea was called, again, to illustrate to Israel their spiritual condition, but this is a true story about a true man who has been instructed by God to go marry someone of immorality. They had become a nation, Israel had, that was bent away from God and directed towards false gods. So whether or not he was instructed to marry someone who is currently a prostitute or not, that's a debate. Could be subject for debate, but the truth still stands. The lady that he was going to enter into a covenantal relationship with through marriage was a person who was extremely immoral. I tend to believe that, to keep the illustration accurate, in case you're wondering, I tend to believe that his wife was currently involved in prostitution because Israel was currently involved in spiritual immorality. And so regardless, the unique request is given to Hosea. Could you imagine? And Hosea, what you notice here is there is no debate. Look at the end of verse number 2. So there's the instruction that's given at the end of verse number 2. And verse number 3, it says what? The first what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. First 5 words of verse number 3 is what? So he went and he... Wait, where is the debate between Hosea and God? Where is the argument where Hosea tries to convince God that this is really a bad idea? This must not be what you were thinking. Where is the outward rebellion of Hosea to say, I'm really struggling with this one, God? What you really find is Hosea was willing to be used of God to paint a picture for Israel, and you see no debate, do you? What you find is a specific display of obedience on part of Hosea. You don't see a debate. God says, go and do this. The next verse, 5 words in, so he went and he took. Now watch. Verse number 3. So he went and he took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, which conceived and bare him a son. And so Hosea demonstrates a beautiful picture of obedience to God, and he marries a woman by the name of Gomer, and then Gomer also gives Hosea 3 children that we're going to look at. Now remember, the characteristic that we're trying to show you this morning is God is gracious. We really haven't seen it so far, but then you get into the lives and specifically the names of their children. So you look at verse number 4. And the Lord said unto him, unto Hosea, call his name Jezreel, for yet a little while, and I will avenge the blood of Jezreel upon the house of Jehu, and will cause to cease the kingdom of the house of Israel. So Hosea and Gomer have a child. That child is going to be named Jezreel, whose name means God who scatters. And in this child's birth, it was going to be a significant name that is given to him, signifying a judgment that is right around the corner for Israel because of their spiritual wickedness and condition. And God is prophesying the end of a kingdom, and Jezreel, this boy, will be the banner of judgment to come. Because listen, everyone who knew the name Jezreel would equate judgment to that name. Well, that's gracious. Have we proven the point yet? Not yet. Keep reading. Look at verse number 6. And she conceived again and bare a daughter, and God said unto him, call her name Ruhamah, for I will no more have mercy upon the house of Israel, but I will utterly take them away. 2 real children, but 2 illustrations for Israel. The first one, there is coming a judgment, and the kingdom is going to end. And then, here comes a daughter. Now, I'm most likely mispronouncing the name, so you'll just have to go with it. But Lo Ruhamah means no compassion. Hosea had given his heart to Gomer, but apparently this exchange of love was not reciprocated by her back to him. And Gomer apparently had returned back to her lifestyle and became pregnant with a daughter that was not his. And as a result, God instructs Hosea to name her Lo Ruhamah, which means no compassion or no pity, or if you want to take it this far, it would be true, no love. Because for Israel, the instruction was this: God's compassion toward your sin has run dry. Remember your older brother's name? There's coming a judgment. And yes, at times when we get so far into sin, God has to intervene and do something. Does that mean he's no longer a God of compassion? Absolutely not. But sometimes Hebrews teaches us that because of his love and compassion towards us, that compassion manifests itself as discipline, and his heart is still for Israel, but his impatience towards their sin has been evident. And so in the naming of this child, God is signifying to Israel that I am done showing you compassion because you chose sin. Now I choose the consequences. And so this child represented a message from God in verse number 6. He says, I have no more mercy for you. But, what does he say? I will utterly take you away. So 2 kids, 1, there's coming a judgment. 2, there's no more compassion. But remember our character trait we're trying to learn of God. What is it? God's gracious. Have you seen it yet? Still not there. 1 more child. Look at verse number 9. Let's start in verse number 8. Now when she had weaned Lo-Ruhamah, she conceived and bare a son. Then said God, call his name Lo-Ami. For ye are not my people, and I will not be your God. Lo-Ami means not my people, not mine. And a second daughter was conceived, also not Hosea's, as indicated in her name, but for Israel. They had decided to reject God, so God decides to reject them. Listen, when we get to a point where we have rejected God, that's scary ground to be walking on. The same God who had delivered Israel out of Egyptian captivity is the same God who has made a special covenant with them. But now he's saying, I have to intervene. Listen, do you know this? No biblical prophet ever pronounced only doom and gloom. Do you know that? Go through the major and minor prophets. And when we think about prophets, we think of their pronouncement of coming destruction that is coming to Israel. But you will also notice that along the lines of that predicted judgment are also signs of hope. Listen to me very careful. I said already, God is gracious. We saw 3 children that was supposed to be illustrative of the condition of Israel. They are going to be judged. God is done with mercy. And he is disowning them of sorts. But where's the hope in that? You just said that no prophet ever just predicts doom and gloom. Look at verse number 10. You ready? Here comes the gracious nature of God stepping in. Yet the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured nor numbered. And it shall come to pass that in the place where it was said unto them, ye are not my people, there it shall be said unto them, ye are the sons of the living God. What just happened? What just happened in verse number 10? And then I'll tell you what, let's go on to verse number 11 and we'll tie it all together. Then shall the children of Judah and the children of Israel be gathered together and appoint themselves one head. So there won't be a northern and southern kingdom anymore. They'll all be back into unity, and they shall come up out of the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel, that judgment. What happened? All right, stay with me. Prophetic books are interesting for sure, but can be confusing. What happens? How do we find grace in prophetic judgment and rejection of God? Is that not what we find here? God is pronouncing because of your immorality that I am going to reject you, but yet God is gracious. And what you find here in verse 10 and verse 11 is a reminder of the relationship that he promised to Israel. This is a temporary thing that I would like to fix. I understand that you have these 3 reminders of these little children running around. I understand that I am at a point of lacking mercy for you because of your wickedness. But here's what happens in chapter 2. Here is the introduction of grace. It begins in verse 10 and verse 11. Then you get to chapter 2, verse 1. Watch this real careful. Say ye unto your brethren Ami and to your sisters Ruhamah. Watch in verse number 1. What did we just notice? Pay special attention to the younger 2 names. What 2 letters were dropped off their name? Lo. The negative. What just happened? I don't want you to refer to them as no more compassion, and I don't want you to refer to them as not my people any longer. As a matter of fact, in chapter number 2, verse 1, there is a name change that is given, and now he's saying, I am compassion, and I am your God, and you are my people. What do you find there? In spite of the wickedness that Israel finds themselves in, when they decide to come back to God, He is more than adequate and more than merciful and more than willing to change our name and to reclaim us and begin showing us compassion and grace once again. You cannot venture far enough into sin so that God becomes a permanent rejecter of your life. And herein is grace. That which was not my people becomes my people. That which is experiencing no more compassion will now experience the reception of my love once again. And the grace is this, that even when our name, all right, here comes a name tag, even when our name is sinner, and even when our name is one who rejects God, we can still find grace in His eyes. Does that make sense? Why do we give? We give because we serve a gracious God who has given us a new name. He loves us and has compassion on us. And yeah, sometimes He needs to take us to the woodshed and light into us a little bit because, let's be honest, we can be a little stubborn at times and a little bit sinful. But that's not the end of the story. God wants to step in and literally change our names because He's a gracious God. Amen. We get into chapter number 2, verse number 2 and following, and here's the second statement. God is a holy God. We cannot overemphasize the eternal importance of the grace of God, but we can never de-emphasize the importance and the centrality of the holiness of God either. For Hosea, could you imagine how gut-wrenching this must have been? To know that he was called of God to marry someone that was going to be unfaithful to him, and now to have at least 2 children that were not his. Could you imagine the sleepless nights? Because what it appears is that the love of his life has now totally turned her back on him. And Gomer didn't just leave, but was now finding herself pursuing other men. Could you imagine the heartache and the agony that Hosea must have experienced at this point? And for God, it must be the same when we choose to pursue other interests other than His. Israel had become ungrateful. They were stooped in idolatry. They were extremely hypocritical. But most importantly, Israel had forgotten that their God is a holy God who cannot look upon sin. And definitely, He is a holy God who will not bless a nation whose God is not the Lord. And the message from Hosea is this: God's going to judge your rejection of Him, but He's still gracious. He's still willing to forgive you. But never lose sight of the holiness of God. Now, I wanted to come to the third character trait real quick, because I really wanted to get to chapter 3, all right? Study chapter 2 on your own. I promise you'll be encouraged by it. But get to chapter number 3 with me, because He is a holy God, but then you get to chapter number 3. I want you to see the first 3 verses here. Again, remember the backdrop of all of this. Hosea now finds himself alone. He knows that his wife is being unfaithful to him. She is totally left, hasn't come back whatsoever. We know that God is a compassionate God. We know that He is a holy God. But I want you to show you this last one. He is a God of love. Now, where do you find that in this whole book? At least until the first 3 chapters, it seems like for Hosea, God has dealt him a pretty awful hand. I mean, how would you call a prophet to do such a work and to endure such a painful lifestyle? Is it really just to paint a picture? Is it really just to prove a point to Israel? I don't think so. I think there's a lot more meaning that we can find here. And so for God, it must have been the same as he watches Israel be unfaithful to him, but he wants to come back to chapter number 3 instances. And chapter 3 picks up with Hosea's personal life. Chapter 2 deviates a little bit, has a lot of application specifically for Israel. And chapter 3 comes back to the narrative of Hosea and Gomer. Gomer has totally left him to pursue her lifestyle of choice, but somehow Gomer lands herself into slavery. And here's what Hosea now hears from God. Look at chapter 3, verse 1. This will blow your mind. Then said the Lord unto me, go yet, love a woman beloved of her friend, yet an adulteress. According to what? To the love of the Lord. So here was God's request. Folks, listen to me. Stay with me. Could you put yourself into the shoes of Hosea with me? Oh my goodness, for crying out loud, as if it's not bad enough to have to experience the unfaithfulness of a spouse. Now, that same spouse who has decided to break your heart, right, has found herself for whatever reason in slavery. She's accrued a debt somehow that she's unable to work off. And what does God say? I want you to go and to love her again. Wait, God, she's been unfaithful. Do you know what kind of person she is? Do you understand what you're asking of me right now when you say, I want you to go and love her again? Love someone who right now is not loving you. How could God make such a request? How could he expect Hosea to pursue the wife that had pursued other relationships? And you want to know the answer to that question? We found it in verse number 1 of chapter 3. He makes that request because it is the same demand he self-imposes on himself. Did you notice that? According to the love of the Lord toward the children of Israel, what are they doing? The children of Israel is being unfaithful to God, so God is not asking Hosea to do anything that he himself wasn't experiencing. And so God isn't asking Hosea to do anything that he hasn't done himself. And could you imagine the pain? I mean, picture it. As she comes up on the auction block, here comes Hosea into the room, and doubtless, because of his position as a prophet and his position as her husband, probably was known. And he walks into the room, and he looks up on the platform where she's being paraded in front of people, hoping to get the highest dollar. Here comes Hosea into that room, knowing in the back of his mind, I've got to do something about this. God has called me to love her. Does she deserve it? Not a chance. Has she earned my love? Not even close. And so as the auction begins, here comes Hosea onto the scene. Could you imagine the pain? Could you imagine the embarrassment? Could you imagine the humility that must have been involved as he now has to bid to buy back his wife? Something by marital standards was already his relationship to be had. And what's he doing? That's already my wife. Now I have to buy her back. I have to gain her a second time. That's crazy talk. I cannot imagine having to go back and buy his wife who by her own choice left him. But I want you to listen real quickly. God is a gracious God. He's a holy God, and he's a loving God. And what you see in Hosea is what he chooses to do for you, and he chooses to do for me. He sees us in our sin with a debt that we cannot work off. We are slaves to sin, and God says, I choose to love you anyway. Amen. And so what you find in verse number 2 is what happens. You see in verse number 2, where did it go, of chapter number 3? So I, Hosea speaking, bought her to me. Now folks, listen, he's already had the wedding. All of that is out of the way, and she chose to run away from it. The relationship, the marriage covenant had already been entered into, and now Hosea goes and spends money to buy her back. Can I remind you this morning that we who are rightfully God's people, by creative authority, if for no other reason, He created us and we are rightfully His, you and I chose to be slaves to another and we turn to sin. We are the ones that God came and He chose to do what? He chose to buy us back. Amen. Does that make any sense to you? It doesn't add up. We don't deserve it. We didn't earn it. And yet the graciousness and the love of God intersects into our lives, and He chose to purchase us not by shelling out any type of money. But if you remember with me, what does the Bible say? That we were bought with a price, which was the precious blood of Christ, and we cannot lose sight of the value that God has placed on our lives, and we must not lose sight of His love. This morning you received that name tag. Maybe you jumped the gun a little bit and you wrote your name on it. Maybe you didn't. Here's what I want to ask you to do. I want you to grab that name tag. If it's already on your shirt, that's fine. I want you to grab a pen or something. I'm serious. If your husband fell asleep, right in the ribs. Go for it. Grab a pen real quick. Because here's what I want to ask you to do. We must identify with God's illustration and realize that every one of us, while we have a name, and we indicated it on this card, or on this sticker, we have one name in common. If you wrote your name on that, we need to write a line right through our given name, and every one of us hold the name of Gomer. Every one of us. I want you to write that on that sticker. If you choose not to wear it, that's up to you, because it's not a flattering name. Probably not something you're going to name a child anytime soon, but I want you to think about the illustration behind this. You and I totally understand what it is to be a Gomer. We find ourselves in sin. We find ourselves slaves to sin. We find ourselves in need to be bought. We find ourselves in a debt that we cannot buy ourselves out of. And we, as slaves to sin, are loved so much by God that for every Gomer in this room, He chose to buy back, listen, what was already His to begin with. And the fact that God offers, here's the word that we're tossing around, that word redemption. The idea of to buy back, that redemption is offered to you and I, and there is nothing short of a miracle involved when a Gomer gets bought back by a Hosea. That is an eternal miracle. And the question then is, as you're thinking about this in 2 weeks from now, as an act of worship to give back to God, when you understand the eternal implications of redemption, how do you not worship? The question is no longer, should I worship? The question transforms into, how can we not worship when we understand the graciousness and the redemption of God? Listen, we give money to a lot lesser of causes that have zero eternal implication. The fact that you and I can experience the redemption of God is a miracle. So let's look at this in Hosea chapter 3, and let's define the ingredients to redemption, and we'll call it a morning. What does it take for someone to buy back someone else? Well, you find in verse number 1, here it is. Love. Is that not what he's calling Hosea to do? Go yet, love a woman. Hosea's thinking, well, I tried that once. Didn't work out too well. Go love a woman. Someone who has turned her back on you. Someone who has been extremely unfaithful to you. Go and love that woman. Do you know what you find in Romans chapter 5, verse 8 concerning you and I? That God demonstrated His love toward us in that while we were yet what? Say it. What did He do? He died for us. Let's talk about that word sinner for a second in Romans 5:8. Which sin did he die for? Did he die for the little white lies and the little small sins that in our eyes? I mean, Gomer, she's a pretty awful person. We can agree on that. But you and I, we're not so bad. God died for us, absolutely. But, compared to Gomer, I'm not that bad. Maybe I shouldn't write that name on my name tag. No. Lest we be guilty of degrading sins, which God does not view in that light. When God says that he demonstrated his love towards us and that while we were yet sinners, he still bought us back. Amen. Christ still died for us. Amen. And when you think about this, there was an immense price that had to be paid. And you find that in verse number 2. And it was a sacrifice. See, the ingredients of redemption is first of all love and second of all sacrifice. So verse number 2 of Hosea 3, so I bought her, I sacrificed her to me. Do you know what Gomer's price was? Jeff mentioned this in the offertory, and Carol leaned over and said, that's all they had to do? That's all it took? 15 pieces of silver, half the price of a common slave. 1.5 homers of barley. Barley was the offering that was given by someone who was accused of unfaithfulness and adultery. And so the price that Hosea had to pay to buy back Gomer was extremely low. You know what that says? Whoever she was in debt to didn't have a high value of her, did he? Or she, whoever it would have been. Didn't really care much about her. She served her purpose and then they move on. Can I tell you the same thing is true when we find ourselves slaves to sin? Sin doesn't care about you. Satan does not care about you. You know what Satan cares about? Tearing you down and destroying you. You have a cheap price tag in the eyes of the adversary. But in the eyes of God, here's the point. The person who she was enslaved to may not have cared about her and had a low value of her, but Hosea cared, Hosea valued, and Hosea sacrificed so he could buy her back in her condition. You know what the Bible says in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 18? Listen to me. For as much as ye know that ye were not redeemed with corruptible things, there's no requirement of monetary payment or an amount of barley that would suffice as silver or gold, but watch what you were redeemed with the precious blood of Christ, as the Lamb without blemish and without spot. So you see the ingredients of redemption there. It demands love and it demands sacrifice. I want you to see this last thought. And can I show you this real quickly, just by way of a side note? Does Hosea come and buy her back and then say, well, I'm only going to buy you back if you get things in order, then I'll come and pay? You need to get your life right, Gomer, and then I'll come buy you back. Is that how he worked? I mean, does that make sense? Hosea came to where Gomer was, right there. Came to her in her sin. Didn't expect Gomer to get everything together. Get your life straight and then we'll talk. No, that's not the way it worked. He bought her back in spite of her sin. Man, what an amazing picture for you and I. God doesn't say, hey, listen, you want to get saved? That's all well and good. I don't blame you. Get your act together first, then I'll save you. God doesn't say that. That's not what we call the good news of the gospel. And so what happens in verse number 3? Chapter number 3. So he's instructed, verse number 1, he buys her back and sacrifice, verse number 2. And then in verse number 3, there's a little conversation that takes place between Hosea and Gomer. Rightfully so. And I said unto her, thou shalt abide for me many days, and thou shalt not play the harlot, and thou shalt not be for another man. So will I also be for thee. What's he doing? He's reminding them of their vows. Stop running away. Here's the last ingredient to redemption, and the word would be faithfulness. Hosea reminds Gomer of the fact that she has been now bought back. She's been redeemed. So he's making a request. Stay faithful. Stop running away. I'm going to do the best I can to care for you. I'm going to meet your needs. I'm going to make some promises and keep them. As a matter of fact, what you find is the word in verse number 3. You find the word abide. Stay faithful. You know what John chapter 15, verse 4 says for you and I? Abide in me, Jesus says, and I in you. Same principle, different book of the Bible. God says to you and I have redeemed you. So here's my request. Stay faithful. Does he say stay perfect? Nope. It's not going to happen. Stay faithful. Stay faithful to me for many days, and I promise you, God says, I'll do the same. How do we receive that redemption that we've talked about? We receive redemption simply by faith. It's us believing that we are who God says we are. I would fill in the name James, and then right underneath it, I would write the word from the perspective of God, a sinner, because I've offended his holiness. How do we receive redemption? We believe that God did what he said he did, and he redeemed us through the precious blood of Christ that was offered for our redemption, not just for many days, but for eternity. So then you get to take your name and you scratch out sinner, and you can rewrite the word redeemed after it, because we've been bought back. As a matter of fact, many days is a pretty long time, but redemption is eternal. Amen. Look at your name tag. And I could write it with you. Look at that name tag. And I want you to think about this. Hello, my name is what? Gomer. Hey, Gomer. How's it going back there, Gomer? Not Gomer Pyle. All right? Wrong Gomer. Hey, Gomer. You know what that signifies? It puts us all in the same field when we walk out of here, understanding that every one of us, we're not better than each other. We're not better than a world that may not be redeemed yet. We're all Gomers. And if you've placed your faith in Christ, you're just a Gomer that's been redeemed. He still has compassion for you. You have become his people. He's dropped the low off of your name. And that's who we are. Think about our opening phrase that I gave you. Eternal redemption, what does it do? It changes us. It alters our temporal routines. The simple fact that we have been redeemed should change the way we view the routine of giving back to him in an act of worship through our tithes and our offerings. For some, it might be a kickstart to getting back to giving. For others, it might be that first instance of giving back to God. Why? Because, man, the pastor did a good job. He really guilted us into this one. No! Because the church needs it in our bathrooms. The toilets are always running, and we need a facelift because we're sure we want to do things with excellence. No! We give back as an act of worship because we have an understanding of what redemption's all about. And because our desire is to be faithful to God, we give back to him as an act of worship as prescribed in God's Word. And the routine of giving should never become a routine, but it's an act of worship. Just like singing, just like coming to church, just like sharing the gospel. Listen to me. If you give because I asked you to, keep the check in your pocket. And if you give because you want a nicer restroom, keep the check in your pocket. Because our giving is worship, and redemption causes us to worship, and it shouldn't ask us, and we should not be asking the question, should I worship? That's crazy. The question is, why wouldn't I? The question becomes, what do I give? Because think about it, folks. What did God hold back from you and I? He pulled out all the stops. Why would we be any different when we understand the redemption that we have in Christ?